Welcome to Kepler Conversations. I'm Dr. Scott Postma. Kepler is an online marketplace for classical Christian education. We employ the historic university model and leverage the best available technology so that we can empower families by liberating teachers and make classical liberal arts education available, accessible, and affordable. Today, I'm joined by Kepler teacher, Mrs. Vanessa Priestner. Mrs. Priestner is the wife of a diehard Cowboys fan and the mother of three young men whom they've homeschooled into adulthood. Over the last 2 decades, she has taught in homeschool co-ops and tutorial settings. She's led mock trial teams, coached novice Lincoln Douglas debaters, and coached students in competitive speech events. She also teaches the lost tools of writing online as well as in Classical Christian University Model Academy. And she's a CiRCE-certified master teacher and is pursuing a Master of Arts in the Great Books through Memoria College. Welcome, Mrs. Priestner.
Thank you.
Well, as we get started in our conversation today, one of the things that our guests love to hear about is you, wanting to get to know you a little bit better. And so outside of the classroom, what do you love to do? What are you have hobbies, or, are you, a big hiking fan, or you, what is it that the Priestners love to do?
Well, right now I've got two sons this year who are getting married. One got married a few months ago. Another one is getting married next week. And so as the mother of the groom, I don't have nearly as much to do as the mother of the bride. But I'm trying to get a slideshow together of my son, and, crying and laughing as I go along doing those kinds of things. So I'm trying to be available for adult children. And
okay.
I'm still homeschooling my high schooler. And so trying to be available and flexible for him as he transitions, as he makes, I'm not his only teacher. He works, he is involved in competitive speech and debate, and he hangs out with friends. So I try to be flexible for those kinds of things. And then I love to read books. I like to spend time with my husband and our dogs. We love our dogs. We're animal people. There was a time when I loved to work in the yard, but I've been only able to keep succulents alive recently. So I'm hoping at some point my yard begins to be beautiful again, but right now I'm just trying to make it, stay alive.
Well, it sounds like you've got a lot on your plate with, sons transitioning into adulthood and marriage. And so that's a full-time, I wouldn't call it a hobby, but a full-time job in itself, right? And then
it's a fun job, though. It's fun.
Fantastic. Well, can you give us a little background also about your own education? I know a lot of classical educators, are passionate about classical education because, recognizing how it transforms and molds and shapes. But a lot of us come to classical education from various backgrounds, discovering it later in life, or were raised that way. And we'd love to hear your story. What's the journey of your education?
Yeah, I grew up in Southern California and went to public and private schools. And then we moved to Texas toward the end of my high school, and I finished in public school. So I had no idea that classical education existed. I had no interest in ancient anything. I read some of the great books. I read good books and great books, but, and I've come to see how some of my teachers were doing a great job of slowing me down, slowing us down so that we could focus on a book and actually begin to think about some of it and understand some of it, instead of just ticking boxes, trying to read as much as possible or read bits of things. There was a lot of reading bits of things, being exposed to things. Like I knew who the Cyclops was in the Odyssey, but I had no idea that the Odyssey was the masterpiece that it is, or just the fun story that it is, the adventure that it is. And it scared me. Just the sound of the Iliad and the Odyssey sounded like something that I wasn't prepared to read or understand. And it was only when I began homeschooling my own children and was exposed to CiRCE and Roman Roads and Memoria Press and places like that were telling me that were equipping me and that were getting me excited about human questions and ideas over time. That Odysseus is an ideal, and he is an epicuro, but he's also someone I can understand. And the things that happen in his story are things I can relate to. And I actually have a son who wrote a song based on the Odyssey, just because it was something that built his chest, and it's built the chest of all three of my sons. And it's a story we love. So I came to understand, I stopped being afraid. I was made to believe that I didn't have to have some special background to understand a well-told tale, a story that resonates with humans across time. Humans back then were not noticeably different from humans now. I'm not talking about epicuros. I can't do Achilles. I couldn't just do a war cry and terrify an entire army. There was a time when I could terrify my kids, but now it's not so easy. But I came to understand that those stories are not that different from the good stories keep getting retold. Mm-hmm. Let me say that. And we see that even in Bible stories that David's an epicuro, and he's someone who changed the face of a nation and was used by God, but who is also a man after God's own heart who sinned mightily and was forgiven. So, and we can relate to that part. We can relate to the Psalms that he wrote and the grief that he felt over a son betraying him, all those things. So those stories still resonate with us even now.
Do you think, I have a couple of questions just to kind of follow up on that. The first, I'm going to kind of work backwards, but the first one, you mentioned David in light of being an epicuro, and having read, about Odysseus in the Odyssey. Do you think that these epic stories or these classical books, do they help us even understand Scripture better or differently, or is it the other way around? What is your experience there?
So I was exposed to Scripture first, but I began to understand sacrifice and blood sacrifice and cleansing, and the wars, the stories, like the book of Joshua. I began to understand, and Saul falling on his sword. All of those things made so much more sense to me after reading epics and after reading like Julius Caesar and the stories that came after, but that are looking back to that time and looking back to those stories. So for me, yes, it did give me a deeper understanding of the story, the true stories in the Bible. Just like Narnia helped me see Jesus in a way that I never had through Aslan.
I love that. That's been my own experience as well. Once you kind of get an understanding of the greater picture of the culture of the day, all of a sudden the Bible came to life in ways it hadn't. Another thing that you said I thought was really interesting, and especially given as you're a teacher and what Kepler's platform is attempting to do, you talked about having some teachers that helped you slow down or encouraged you to know that these are stories worth reading. Not necessarily that they had to teach you what it meant, but to help you, guide you, to them and navigate your approach to them. And in my own experience, I remember I was a young single guy in the military wanting to read. I don't know what gave me the itch, but I thought I need to read classic books. I read Stephen King, whenever I was a high school, public school educated, and I would need to do. So I went to the classic section of the bookstore and I picked up J.D. Salinger's, Catcher in the Rye. I think that was the first thing I read, and I was like, I'd never thought about, now, since then come to understand some different things about it, but I didn't have a guide, I guess is my point. And so I was just sort of randomly trying to figure that out. But what you just described as a guide, can you talk a little bit more about that experience and how a teacher can be a guide that way?
Yeah. One thing that comes to mind, and this is slightly tangential, but when you're talking about looking for books to read, I started reading, I looked at book lists, but I started reading books recommended by people I respected and people who loved books and who loved reading and who were based in a tradition. So it wasn't just the new thing was the great thing, the better thing. It was that it was grounded in a tradition that people had been thinking about these things and asking these questions and telling stories of lives that embodied some of these ideas for centuries. And they saw the pattern, and they were part of a conversation, how these books and stories are, kind of, like you said, riffing off of one another. I don't know if you said it before we started the recording or afterwards, but they're responding, and they're maybe enlarging or questioning or pushing back a little bit on some of it. But they're not just throwing things away. They are kind of like Malcolm Guite is someone I just love to listen to, and he is writing. He's taking part of the King Arthur story and putting it into poetry. And he was talking about how the tradition of King Arthur, the stories were told by different people, and some episodes were just alluded to. And so he's going to take one of those episodes that was alluded to, and he's going to write it. But he's doing it from within grounded within a tradition and respecting that tradition, not taking a story and flipping it on its head and inverting it and telling saying this story of Sleeping Beauty or Snow White or whatever isn't true. Let me tell you the story of the villain and how the villain is someone we should empathize with and isn't really as bad as you think. It's not that. So one thing I did was listen to people who cared about these things and listen to their advice. One book I read because of that was Anna Karenina. There was a homeschool mom of five boys who would read on her phone. And I was amazed, she didn't have 5 at the time, but she just kept having boys. And she just took little bits of time to read great works. She was someone who convinced me that it wasn't just a story about a woman who cheated on her husband, that it wasn't just melodrama in that way. But I also listened to others in the classical education world who told me this is a human story, and even a story that has a Christian world in the way that right and wrong are shown and consequences are shown, and that it's showing us one couple who has made the decisions they've made and the consequences of those decisions, and another couple who is coming together in union and honoring one another and trying to honor the Lord in the way that they know, and just how we're able to look at those two next to one another. So anyway, that's part of the way that I started reading the things that I was reading. So the way that a teacher can guide you, one of my goals as a teacher is to give students new sight. That's one of the ways that I put it. They're not going to remember everything I said. They're not going to remember everything that happened in a story. They're not going to remember all of the writings, every detail of every writing skill. I know that from my own children who I have taught. I know what I taught them. I know what they held on to and what they didn't. But I've given them a way of seeing the world, a lens through which to see the world, and to wonder at it. And that's my goal. And that's what I think a good teacher can do, is to help us see things that we didn't even know were there, and to stop and pay attention, and then to consider. And one of the things I told one of my students and her mom at the end of the school year was that I hoped that some of the things we talked about would act like grains of sand in her traveling shoes along her journey, that they would bother her some and cause her to consider and think more about these questions that people have been asking throughout time. So that's really my goal. That's what I think a teacher can do, is to slow us down, to consider, to look at the story as a world, first of all, not to be thinking about what everyone has said about the story, but what's happening in that world, what is happening in the lives of the characters in that world. And not how can we use the book to teach ourselves to be virtuous, or how can I use the book to give me some writing prompts. But the story wasn't written for my writing curriculum. It was written because it was a story that the author felt needed to be told in some way, and or a play that needed, that was to be performed and enjoyed and shared. So that's one of the things I'm hoping to help students do too, is to submit themselves to the story, not just stand in judgment over it. Realize that they may not love everything about it, but for some reason, this story has endured, and there are people who have repeatedly found value. People grounded within a tradition who have seen value in this. So how can they look for that, and how can they add that world to their world? How can they add worlds to their own world here and have a greater world because of it?
I think it's very well said. And it speaks to the importance of having the right kind of guide. I think in my own situation, having a guide to be able to see, what would be the best works, to read. But even if it wasn't the best work, how do you look at it in a way that, brings you into that inheritance or that tradition that we're receiving? And so I think that's very well stated. It's so important that we have the right kinds of teachers that are, if we're outsourcing any part of our children's education, we want those kinds of teachers that add that kind of value. Well, you're teaching several Lost Tools of Writing courses for Kepler, 2 in the fall and 1 this summer. And congratulations. Lost Tools of Writing 1 with The Hobbit is filled for the summer.
Yay, Bilbo.
Well, it sounds like you've hit a really good theme. Can you talk about your Lost Tools of Writing courses and how they're important? And feel free to talk about any of them, but I'm very in particular. I'm interested in understanding what is the difference between an accelerated LT1 and then why with a comparison essay, and then what is transition. So you're teaching a couple of these courses, and maybe you could just kind of share some of those concepts with us.
Sure. So the accelerated Lost Tools level 1 with comparison essay, the first semester we would be spending time mostly on the second half of Lost Tools 1, those essays that have added more parts that students can hone. If they've already been through Lost Tools level 1, or if they've at least been through the 1A portion and parents feel they can move on to this class, then this will allow them to work on a complete persuasive essay. And if they've done it before, to hone the portions of the persuasive essay. 2 of my sons worked through Lost Tools level 1 more than one time, but at a slightly faster pace the second time. And they were reading different books at the time that they were writing through level 1 again, but students don't always fully grasp each lesson the first time. Most of us don't. I'm amazed at when I've come back through something, whether it's history or reading a book more than once, which I highly recommend for books that are worth revisiting. I see things I didn't see before, and I understand something stands out to me that I wasn't able to see when I was trying to get the big picture of the story, but details jump out at me, and I start to notice things about characters that I didn't notice the first time around. It's the same thing with writing. As I've gotten comfortable with just the form of the persuasive essay and what is expected in each portion, then I can work to hone certain sections, the way that I write certain portions, so that I can become a better writer, and so that I can help others better understand me, more easily understand me, and actually persuade them, because they have to be able to understand you for you to be able to persuade them that what you're saying is true. So that's one thing. And that's really the idea behind level 1 to level 2 transition. I think that level 1 to level 2 is a big leap and a different way of thinking. So level 1 is asking, should a character have done something in the past? Should they have taken some action that they took? And then that's your focus. And then you look at all the things around that action. Why did they do what they did? Who was affected by what they did? How did the story change? Things like that. But also what is true in general. Is this ever a good action to take? There you can just use general principles there as well. But you can't just write based on general principles. You need to stick within the story. One of the things that I really try to help students do is to gather details from the story that show why the principle is true. How does the principle work out in real life? If we want to persuade people, we can't just quote principles. We have to show them how it works in the lives of humans, or in Watership Down, how it works in the lives of rabbits. By the way, I would argue that Watership Down is another epic. It reminds me of the Aeneid, and I love that story. Watership Down, I mean. Anyway, as far as level 1 to level 2, I just have noticed that what I want to do is really strengthen the foundation of level 1. It's not that we're repeating all of level 1, or even I'm not repeating lessons as much as I am trying to add levels of detail to lessons and seeing where students are before they move into level 2, so that we've strengthened some things before I start to add elocution elements and things that are secondary to how they are making their ideas clear. Because now they're going to be asking a whole different question. It's whether someone should be punished or admonished for what they've done. And they're going to be considering laws and principles and mores and things like that. But they're also going to consider motive, and they're going to consider, we're going to begin speaking about virtue and traditional virtues. So there's a lot within that course, and I want to make sure that they have a strong foundation before we start adding those other layers. But it's really fun. Students love to talk about those things and think about them. The other part is differentiating justice from benefit. The fact that something is beneficial does not make it just. So we begin to flesh some of that out.
That's excellent. I love that you're employing this idea that I think Richard Weaver called us language citizens, that our ability to communicate well, and he called it unsentimental sentiment. We have to be able to do it in a way that is not full of relish sentiment, but an unsentimental sentiment. What C.S. Lewis called the proper emotional responses to something. In man, but that what you're doing is employing these writing principles or these writing lessons to real life contribution to life, and not just some dry grammatical approach to language, but really what language or writing is actually for, and in embodying it in a text that they are interacting with these big ideas is huge. And so I really appreciate that you're bringing that to bear in your writing classes.
And you mentioned, I'm sorry, you mentioned just sentiment. And in our persuasive essays, we are using logical arguments, but we're also employing emotional appeals. But they need to be appeals to just sentiment, not emotional appeals for the sake of emotion or to cover up the fact that we don't really have good arguments, but to appeal to the whole human being. Because we are logical, but we are also emotive, and God made us that way. And God gave us imaginations that are able to imagine what someone else is going through, or what brought this to be. And we need to employ both of those things. So we're trying to work on well-rounded essays.
Now that's fabulous. And as you're talking about that, I just reminded how this whole conversation right now, the cultural conversation on what's good empathy and bad empathy, and just sentiments and not, that really plays into a lot of what we need as Christian writers to be able to bring back into the culture is this rational public discourse that, does employ just sentiment and right arguments and logic. So, that sounds wonderful. Could you maybe leave us as we kind of wrap up our conversation? I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'm really thankful for the time that you've given. I'm just wondering, maybe you could leave us with, I don't know, a short nugget or something that might whet the appetite of the audience. I mean, I think you've given us a lot already, but is there something, like you mentioned Watership Down, in terms of justice, wonderful book, by the way. Any nugget you could leave us with? I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but.
No. One of the things that I think the literary selections that we've got books and plays, except for the Hobbit class, everything, the other two classes contain books and at least one play. And they span from ancient, from like 5th century BC to 20th century, early 20th century, first half of the 20th century with Watership Down and C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. But we've got something from turn of the 16th to 17th century with Shakespeare in one of them, and then a 20th century play too. So the students are going to be able to practice reading translations of ancient texts, which are actually a little easier to read than Shakespeare in my view, just because it's, our more modern language in the translation. But then also to appreciate the beauty of Shakespeare's language and his mastery of just human nature, of painting human nature for us. But then we have the chance to look at something like Watership Down, that is a story about rabbits, but it incorporates Arabian Nights type of storytelling. It reminds me, the stories that they tell, their oral tradition is like the Arabian Nights, the stories of 1001 Arabian Nights. But also they've got a character that's like Odysseus. The stories of one set of rabbits they help tell them who they are, what a rabbit is to be, and they help guide them. And we see other rabbits who don't tell those tales, who don't pass those stories down, who pay a price for it in different ways, in different types of, I don't know if civilization is the right word, maybe thinking of them more as countries or something like that. But we're able to look at those things and the role that story plays in helping us know who we are. So that's something I get excited about, just the sampling of different time periods, but the same human story throughout, and the importance of story throughout.
And that is our story, isn't it? That our identity comes through that narrative that we, that we inherit. Thank you so very much for sharing this and spending the time, to talk through these issues and have a Kepler conversation. To our audience, I just want to let you know that all of Mrs. Priestner's courses, the links to her courses, will be here in the show notes, and you can access those and take a look at them. And the ability to contact her, you'll find her contact information on the Kepler website, on her profile, and the links will be there as well. And Mrs. Priestner, once again, thank you so much for giving the time.
Thank you for visiting with me today.
Yeah, God bless you all.